Alrighty, well, good morning, everybody. Yeah, that sun shining through there is kind of bright. Anyway, Rocky and I just had a nice feast of leftover fried chicken for breakfast. I find when I get that meal at the store, the wedge fries, they give you so many wedge fries that I sometimes end up filling up on them. And then I don't have room for the chicken. So last night I ate one piece of chicken and I ate a bunch of wedge fries. I never even finished the wedge fries before I was full. But I took the two pieces of chicken that were left over, because it was like a 3-piece meal, and I put them in a margarine tub in the refrigerator. And that was just Rocky and I's breakfast. So it was quite good. Anyway, in about an hour, I have to be in Perth with my truck. So I'm going to make this quick. I'm going to tell you all a story. Um, this goes back to when I was a little boy, and it's the beginning of my school career and riding on the school bus. And this goes back now to 1972, 73, and there. So we're going back over 50 years anyway. It was a different world 50 years ago. Any of you my age or older will remember that it was quite different. And nowadays, of course, safety and all that is a big deal. In the early 1970s, not so much. um, and Now they force school bus operators to replace their buses every 10 years. Of course, nowadays too, like most vehicles, things aren't what they were, and so probably after 10 years it really needs to be replaced because the quality isn't there like it used to be. Back in the early 70s, it was the opposite situation. They used to run school buses right into the ground. Like, I mean, you'd literally drive it until you could not drive it anymore. Until it got that the cost to keep it repaired was more than what could be earned by operating it, basically. And Anyway, so it wasn't unusual to see school buses from the 40s and 50s still in operation in the 1970s and the early 70s. Anyway, the first bus I ever rode on was an old bus, and it was rough. It was really rough. And in fact, our bus driver, Bruce Thompson, what people used to say is, because that was his bus, and what people used to say is, I mean, it belonged to a fellow by the name of Cameron Armstrong. He owned a fleet of school buses, but that was the bus Bruce Thompson drove. And people used to say that that was his bus because he was the only one who wasn't afraid of it. you know, it was really rough. And it was old, and really rough. Anyway, it was one of those old-fashioned buses with the rounded corners and the big fenders and stuff. It was an old bus. Anyway, it was in rough shape. There were holes in the floor, and it was just a rough bus. You could look down and see the road going by. It was rough. It's a wonder one of us didn't fall through the floor, really. Anyway, burned oil. It was just backfired. Rough bus anyway. I had a book when I was a kid called The Bingity Bangity School Bus when I was a little boy. And that was about an old bus like that, an old school bus. And the school bus in that book actually looked just like the first school bus I ever rode on. you know, so I guess you could say that was the Bingity Bangity School Bus anyway. But the way it worked at that time is us kids from the country who went to the Catholic school, which in those days was known as the separate school, because it was separate from the public school system, we used to ride into town on the high school bus. So this was the bus that picked up the high school kids and brought them in, the teenagers. So even if you were a little kid, you rode on the high school bus. When the bus got to the high school in Perth, everybody got off, and all us kids who were still in grade school, we would stand there and wait for what we called the town bus. Now, the driver of the high school bus, he was a fellow by the name of Bruce Thompson. And this is actually a funny story about Bruce Thompson. Bruce Thompson was really cool. You couldn't help but to love Bruce Thompson, you know. And I'll tell you about him in a minute. But anyway, that was the high school bus. Then we had to wait at the high school. We had to wait about half an hour outside at the high school for the what we called the town bus. And when the town bus come, it was a newer bus than the high school bus. It was in better shape, but it was still, this was the early 70s, so this was still a pretty rough bus. It might have been 5 or 10 years old at that time, but everything on it was standard. It had the great big white steering wheel that, and stuff, the big steering wheel that was about 3 feet across, or 2.5 or 3 feet across. And it was about the size around of a manhole cover, and the 5-speed transmission there with the big lever coming up out of the floor, and stuff beside the driver's seat and all that. That's how it was. And of course it would moan and buck and, it didn't backfire too much or anything, but it used to be an awful moaning, bucking, whining kind of a thing, I never forget the sound of those old buses. They sounded different than they do now. Anyway, the driver of that bus was a fellow by the name of Fonzie McKinnon. And Fonzie McKinnon was an elderly man, and he was a small man, too. There was hardly anything to him. And I remember him leaning over that steering wheel, turning corners and things, and the sweat just pouring off his forehead. He's cranking the big wheel around and stuff, and then bringing it back and all that. Anyway, that was the town bus, and that took us over to St. John's separate school, where we went to school. And that's how it was. Every morning, that was our routine. We got picked up by the school bus like at 7 o'clock in the morning. And, and we'd arrive at school about 9:15, But in a car, if you got in a car and drove directly to our school, it was about a 15-minute drive, So that's just how it was in those days anyway. Anyway, this story, though, is about my first experiences riding on the school bus. And, of course, my first day of kindergarten, when I was 5, I had to get on the school bus. So I waited out by the road with the older kids, with our landlord's daughters. And like that, at that time, I think it was just the landlord's daughters, because I was the oldest one in the trailer park. So I don't think there were any kids in the trailer park, really. At that time, waiting for the bus, it would just be me and Yvonne and Carol Kelly, who were our landlord's daughters. They were a little bit older than I was, and they went to St. John's School, too. So anyway, I see this bus coming down the road, and I'm already scared, I see this bus coming down the road, and this thing is like, I'd seen it before. It's not like I'd never seen it before, but I'd never seen it in the context that I was going to be riding on it. And, of course, it was a beast of a thing anyway, coming down the road. And you could hear guys yelling in there and stuff, and things were flying out the windows, pieces of paper, pencils, and things were being thrown out at parts of people's lunches, apples and things were being thrown out the windows at the back of the bus. And I remember I was determined I wasn't going to show any fear. So when I got on the bus, I went straight to the back of the bus where the big boys sat, where the high school boys sat. And they'd be back there smoking cigarettes. You could actually smoke cigarettes on the school bus at that time. They'd be back there smoking cigarettes and telling dirty stories. I'm sure most of it was bullshit about different girls they'd banged and all that. I'm sure it was, they were trying to outdo each other, you know. I'm sure most of it, if not all of it, was bullshit, but this is what they used to do anyway. And they had dirty magazines they'd be looking at. They had this one magazine that was called Easy Rider, and it was a biker magazine. And there was always a centerfold in it of a beautiful naked girl, and she'd be straddling a Harley. She'd be up on a Harley Davidson motorcycle or whatever, you know. And of course, the kids, these guys were a pretty rough and tumble bunch anyway, and I was scared. But I wasn't going to let on I was scared, so I went straight to the back of the bus and sat down with those guys. And they were duly impressed, you know. I think they kind of respected me for that. And so I kind of become one of the group, one of the crowd anyway. And, you know, they get out the magazine and they'd open up the centerfold and put it in front of me. They'd say, "What would you do with that? Now, if you had that, what would you do with it?" Talking about the girl on the bike, you know, and I'd say, "Well, really, what wouldn't I do with it?" You know, I get them laughing, and I had no idea even what they were talking about. What would you do? What do you mean, what would I do with it? You know, I didn't understand. But I kind of intuitively knew how to respond. So I'd say things like that, give them these vague answers. Well, what wouldn't I do with it? That's the question, you know, get them laughing anyway. And, and there was one guy there, and he had red hair. He looked like Archie Andrews from the Archie comic books, and I kind of nicknamed him Archie. And I'd go back there, and I'd say, "How you doing, Archie?" You know, like that. And he'd say, "Sit down there, and I'll read you a story, young fella." You know, so that he'd be reading me a story, a write-up, you know, that these bikers had done in this magazine about some field party they had or something. And he'd be reading away there, he'd be there, you know. "So we had lots of bitches and hoes, and plenty of whiskey, and other refreshments," you know, like that. "Then a bunch of guys showed up from such and such a chapter of the organization, whatever, the biker gang, you know. And they were righteous dudes, and we partied hardy to the wee hours of the morning." He'd be reading it, you know, like that. And anyway, like I say, they'd be back there smoking cigarettes and looking at pornographic magazines and telling dirty stories and stuff. And I'd go back there and sit with them every day. And I was scared at first, but after a while I got that it was just, you know, I knew these guys would never harm me or anything. In fact, if anybody had tried to harm me, they'd have probably protected me, really. But I mean, the first day I did that, and I was scared, but I was determined not to show how scared I was, so that's what I did. Well, the following year, my cousin Julie started school. And Julie was different. Julie was shy, and I was shy too, actually, but Julie just couldn't overcome her fear. And so she sat right in the front seat behind our driver, Bruce Thompson. Now, Bruce Thompson was quite a character. Bruce Thompson didn't really care what you did on the school bus. It didn't matter to him, you know. Couldn't have cared less. Anyway, every so often he'd look in that overhead mirror, though, you know, that the driver has so he can see the passengers. And he'd yell at the guys in the back, you know, they'd be throwing stuff out the windows and stuff. And he'd yell at them, "Settle down back there, you reprobates," you know. And then he'd go back to driving the bus. He didn't really care, you know. This is what he'd do. "Settle down back there, you reprobates." Anyway, one day, well, when Julie started school, my cousin Julie Fournier, in Lanark County, people say Fernie. You hear that? You've had my last name mispronounced many times. Fournier or Fernie. And so on like that, you know. They pronounce it every way but the correct way. Anyway, Bruce Thompson would say Fernie. You know, so this is part of the story anyway. What does he do? The guys at the back of the bus are cutting up, you know, really getting rowdy. And Bruce Thompson, he looks up in the mirror. Now, Julie's sitting right behind him, cowering in fear, And what does he do? He yells back at them. He says, "Hey, you reprobates back there, settle down. You better settle down or I'll send Julie Fernie back there to beat the piss out of you." Just like that. I guess Julie just wished that wishing that the floor would swallow her up, which it actually could have done because the floor wasn't very good in that bus. But anyway, I'm sure she'd have been perfectly happy to fall through a hole in the floor at that moment. Anyway, I never forgot that. You reprobate, settle down back there, or I'll send Julie Fernie back to beat the piss out of you. you know. The funny thing is, my grandmother relayed the story to me years later because she had seen Julie. I don't know if Julie was over to the house or where she'd seen her, but she'd seen her somewhere after that happened. And Julie was telling her the story. She said, "I'm so mad at that Bruce Thompson. You won't believe what he did." She's telling the story anyway about him threatening to send her back there to straighten those guys out, to physically straighten them out. Anyway, yeah, just a story anyway from back in the old times. I think I've told this story here before, but there'll be people who haven't heard it. I'm sure there's a lot of new subscribers, so there you go. There's a story from the early 70s anyway. But yeah, I remember that though. I remember some of these characters anyway at the back of the bus. I especially remember the one I called Archie because he was a real character. I called him Archie after Archie Andrews. That wasn't his name from the comic books. That wasn't his name, but that because he looked just like Archie from the Archie comic books, But he was the one that used to read me the stories out of the Easy Rider magazines. Because the bikers, they'd have field parties and they'd have big write-ups about the field parties with these grainy black and white pictures, of them partying in the field and stuff like that, wherever they were partying. Apparently, there was a incident just outside of Perth, of my hometown of Perth, not around that time, where there was a field party. A bunch of bikers were partying in some field somewhere, and some hippies showed up and crashed the party. And there was a bit of a riot, and the bikers didn't really like the hippies very much, And I've seen the write-up from the newspaper in an old newspaper about that, and it was a comical thing to read. Because apparently one of the bikers was beating on this hippie and yelling, "Take that, you dirty hippie, you." I mean, just take that, you dirty hippie. And that was written in the newspaper that this biker was heard to say as he was beating on this hippie, "Take that, you dirty hippie, you." Anyway. Oh, I'm sure it's funnier for me to relate a story now than it was for the hippie who was getting his butt kicked by a bunch of outlaw bikers, but still. Funny stuff anyway. It could only have happened back then. That was a different time entirely. Anyway, that's just another comical story, I guess, in a way, unless you're a hippie, in which case maybe it isn't so comical. My apologies to the hippies who got massacred in that battle that day. I'm sure they went there with good intentions, but the bikers weren't really receptive. The bikers weren't so much and weren't really that much about peace, love, and, and understanding or whatever. So anyway, the hippies learned a hard lesson that day, I guess. Not everybody's about peace and love, guys. It is what it is. All right, that's it for now. We'll see you later.